The heat in the sewing room was a living thing, thick and wet, pressing against Delphine's skin like a hand over her mouth. Through the single window, June sunlight fell in a brutal slant across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the air like ash. Outside, the South Carolina Lowcountry sprawled in its languorous decay, Spanish moss draped from live oaks like widow's veils, magnolia blossoms rotted brown at their edges, and somewhere beyond the manicured gardens, the tobacco fields shimmered in waves of heat that made the horizon tremble. Thaddeus Whitmore stood before her in his shirt-sleeves, his throat bare and vulnerable. "Well?" His voice carried the particular impatience of a man accustomed to immediate satisfaction. "Let's see if you've managed not to ruin it, Delphine." She kept her eyes lowered, a habit carved into her bones over 34 years of survival, and reached for the collar draped across her workbench. The linen was perfect, Irish imported, expensive as sin. She had spent weeks on it, each stitch invisible, each seam precisely aligned. The fabric whispered between her fingers like a secret. "Like death." "Yes, Master Whitmore." Her voice was quiet, textured with just enough deference to satisfy without inviting suspicion. She rose from her stool, the movement careful, controlled. 3 days. In 3 days, he would marry Lorelei Ashford in the garden beneath the arbor she'd helped decorate with white camellias. In 3 days, Charleston society would gather to celebrate the union of 2 fortunes, 2 names, 2 bloodlines built on the backs of people like her. In 3 days, if God and chemistry proved merciful, Thaddeus Whitmore would be dead. She approached him with the collar held between both hands, an offering, a sacrament. The bitter almond scent rose faintly from the fabric, so faint she'd convinced herself it was only her imagination, only her guilt making the poison real before it had done its work. She'd masked it carefully, obsessively, with lavender water pressed from the bushes near the kitchen house. Lavender for clarity. Lavender for devotion. Lavender to hide the smell of murder. "Around the neck, master," she said softly, moving behind him. This was the intimacy of servitude, the terrible closeness forced upon those who owned nothing, not even the space their bodies occupied. She had dressed him before. She had mended his clothes, measured his inseams, sewn buttons onto waistcoats while he stood so near she could smell the bourbon on his breath and the bay rum on his jaw. This was the horror of slavery, this forced touching, this violation disguised as duty. But this time, she was the one doing the violating. Her fingers, scarred from years of needle pricks, calloused from thread and scissors and endless work, lifted the collar to his throat. The linen settled against his skin with a whisper. She fastened the brass collar stud at the back, her movements practiced, efficiently. His neck was thick, flushed red from the heat. She could see his pulse jumping beneath the skin, strong and steady. Not for long, she thought, and the darkness of it sang through her like gospel. "It's stiff," Whitmore complained, shifting his shoulders. "Damn uncomfortable. Are you certain you followed the measurements correctly?" "Yes, master." "The stiffness will ease with wear." "The stiffness, and then your breathing, and then your heartbeat, and then everything that makes you a man instead of a corpse." She moved to face him, adjusting the collar's wings, smoothing the fabric with fingers that did not tremble though her heart was a war drum in her chest. This close, she could see the broken capillaries across his nose, the slight yellowing of his eyes, evidence of too much drinking, too much indulgence, too much of everything while others starved. He smelled of tobacco and sweat and expensive cologne, a combination that turned her stomach. "The wedding is in 3 days," he said, examining himself in the small mirror propped on her workbench. He turned his head left, then right, admiring his own neck. "Everything must be perfect. Lorelei's father is bringing half of Charleston with him. Senator Hammond will be in attendance. This collar," he touched it with his thick fingers. "This will be photographed. Do you understand? Your work will be seen by some of the most important men in South Carolina." "Yes, Master Whitmore. I understand. I understand that you sold my son for $800 to cover your losses at the Charleston races. I understand that you broke my mother's hands when she tried to run. I understand that you are a pestilence, and I am the cure. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did, sharp and terrible as a blade between the ribs. 3 years ago. Summer, like now, the heat is oppressive and mean. Cassius had been 8 years old, small for his age but quick-minded, always asking questions about everything he saw. He'd been learning his letters from her in secret, tracing them in the dirt behind the quarters when no one was watching. That morning, she'd been mending curtains in the parlor when Whitmore had come in, his face flushed with rage she'd learned to recognize, the rage of a man who'd lost money and needed to recoup it in flesh. "That boy of yours," he'd said. "Cassius. I've sold him." The curtain had fallen from her hands. The room had tilted. "Master, please. Traders coming this afternoon. I need the money." He'd said it as casually as commenting on the weather. "Should get a good price. He's young enough to train properly." She'd fallen to her knees, actually fallen, her legs giving out beneath her. "Master Whitmore, I'm begging you. Please. He's just a child. He's my property, Delphine. As are you." His voice had been cold, final. "You'll have other children. Now get up and finish those curtains." But she hadn't gotten up. She'd crawled toward him, degrading herself in ways that still burned like acid in her memory, pleading, offering anything, her own life, her labor, anything if he would just let Cassius stay. He'd stepped over her like she was a piece of furniture. That afternoon, she'd held Cassius as the trader's wagon arrived. She'd held him as Whitmore counted out the money. She'd held him until the overseer, Silas Crenshaw, had pried her arms away while Cassius screamed, "Mama! Mama! Don't let them take me, Mama!" His small hands reaching for her as they dragged him to the wagon. She'd screamed too. She'd fought like an animal until Crenshaw had struck her across the face hard enough to split her lip. She'd tasted blood and dirt and the complete annihilation of her soul. The last she'd seen of her son was his face in the back of that wagon, tears streaming down his cheeks, mouth open in a wail she could no longer hear over the distance and her own sobbing. 3 years. She didn't know where he was. She didn't know if he was alive. But she knew Thaddeus Whitmore was standing, breathing, laughing, drinking, whoring his way through life while her son was gone. "Delphine." Whitmore's voice snapped her back to the present. "I asked you a question." She blinked, refocusing on his face. "Forgive me, master. The heat. I asked if you finished Lorelei's veil." "Nearly, master. I'll have it ready by tomorrow evening." He nodded, turning back to the mirror. His fingers traced the collar's edge, and Delphine's breath caught. Could he feel it? The poison soaked into the fibers, waiting for his sweat, his heat, the hours of contact that would drive it through his skin and into his blood. The cyanide had come from peach pits, 40 of them, collected over weeks from the orchard where she was sometimes allowed to walk. She'd ground them in secret, extracted the prussic acid using methods from a botanical book she'd found in his library, of all places. A book about medicinal plants and their deadly counterfeits. The masters never imagined their slaves could read. They never imagined the weapons they left lying around in plain sight. "You do fine work, Delphine," Whitmore said, and there was something in his voice, almost warm, almost kind, that made her hate him even more. "Your stitching is the finest in 3 counties. You have truly gifted hands. These hands held my son. These hands know every inch of his face. These hands have sewn your death into linen so fine you'll wear it with pride. Thank you, master." He unbuttoned the collar, removed it carefully, and handed it back to her. "Keep it safe. I'll collect it the morning of the wedding, along with the rest of my attire." "Yes, Master Whitmore." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't read. For a moment, just a moment, she wondered if he knew. If somehow, impossibly, he'd sensed the murder in her heart. But then he smiled, that casual smile of a man who'd never known consequence. You know, Delphine, I sometimes think you're the only one on this entire plantation who understands quality. The others, well, they do their work, but you. He gestured at the collar in her hands. You have pride in your craft. That's admirable. Truly. The words were acid on her skin. Pride. As if she had a choice. As if she wasn't his slave, his property, forced to pour her soul into fabric that would adorn his body at his pleasure. Thank you, master, she said again, because there was nothing else she could say. He left, his boots heavy on the floorboards, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Delphine stood frozen, the poisoned collar still in her hands. Then her knees buckled. She caught herself against the workbench, gripping its edge hard enough to make her knuckles white. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her whole body trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of what she'd done, what she was doing, what would come. 3 days. She looked down at the collar. The stitching was perfect. Every thread aligned. The poison invisible. She thought of Cassius's face. His laugh. The way he'd called her name. She thought of Whitmore's hands counting out money, her son's price. She thought of justice, not the legal kind, not the kind white men spoke of in courtrooms and churches, but the older kind. The kind written in blood and soil and the bones of the stolen. Slowly, carefully, Delphine wrapped the collar in clean muslin and placed it in the locked drawer of her workbench. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her breathing had steadied. Outside, a mockingbird sang in the magnolia tree. The heat pressed down like a fist. The plantation drowsed in its illusion of permanence, its masters believing themselves immortal, their world eternal. But Delphine knew better. Everything died. Even monsters. Even masters. Especially masters. She returned to her stool and picked up Lorelei's veil, the white lace delicate as spider silk. Her needle caught the light as she began to work again, each stitch precise, mechanical, perfect. 3 days until the wedding. 3 days until reckoning. 3 days until Thaddeus Whitmore wore her handiwork for the last time. The mockingbird sang on, oblivious, as Delphine stitched and planned and remembered her son's face. The collar waited in the drawer. The poison waited in the fabric. And Delphine, scarred, enslaved, unbreakable Delphine, waited too. If you're captivated by this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre stories from history's shadows, and comment below with your thoughts. 2 months earlier, in the dying light of an April evening, Delphine had discovered how to kill a man with peach pits. The library was supposed to be off-limits to slaves, but Whitmore had ordered her to mend the velvet curtains that framed the eastern windows, heavy things, moth-eaten and faded where the sun struck them each morning. She worked alone, grateful for the silence, the temporary escape from the quarters where grief lived in every corner. It had been 6 months since Cassius was sold. 6 months of waking to his absence, of reaching for him in the dark and finding nothing. The curtains smelled of dust and old tobacco smoke. She'd been standing on a ladder, needle in hand, when her eye had caught the spine of a book on a nearby shelf. Green leather, gilt lettering, Flora Medica, a botanical account of all the most remarkable plants used in medicine in different parts of the world. She shouldn't have touched it. Shouldn't have opened it. But grief makes thieves of us all. She'd climbed down, glanced toward the door, the hallway empty, the house quiet, and pulled the volume from its place. The leather was cool beneath her fingers, the pages yellowed but intact. She'd taught herself to read years ago, stealing knowledge the way other slaves stole food, secretly, desperately, knowing discovery meant the lash. She'd flipped through pages of careful illustrations, foxglove, nightshade, hemlock, oleander. Plants that healed. Plants that were killed. The dual nature of the natural world rendered in meticulous ink drawings. And then she'd found it. Page 347. Prunus persica, the peach. While the fruit is wholesome and nourishing, the kernels within the stone contain amygdalin, which when crushed and exposed to moisture produces prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide. Symptoms of poisoning include burning sensation of the throat, difficulty breathing, convulsions, and death. The bitter almond odor is characteristic. She'd stood there, the book open in her hands, reading the passage 3 times. The peach orchard. She was allowed to walk there, Whitmore called it, indulging her melancholy, as if grief were a pet to be exercised. There were 40 trees, heavy with fruit in summer. All those pits. All that poison, waiting to be extracted. Something had shifted in her chest then. Not hope, she'd abandoned hope the day they took Cassius. But purpose. Cold, crystalline purpose. She'd memorized the page. Every word. Then she'd returned the book to its shelf, climbed back up the ladder, and finished mending the curtain with hands that no longer shook. The extraction process had taken weeks to perfect. She'd started small, collecting pits from peaches she was given to eat. Slaves received the overripe fruit, bruised and starting to turn. She'd hidden the pits in her apron, then beneath the loose floorboard under her pallet in the quarters. 10 pits. 20. 30. Each one a small, hard promise. The orchard became her laboratory. She walked there in the evenings when the work was done, when the overseer Silas Crenshaw was drunk on corn whiskey and the other slaves were too exhausted to notice her absence. The light turned golden through the leaves, and Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze like something drowning slowly. She'd found a hollow in an old oak tree at the orchard's edge, far enough from the main house to be safe, close enough to the quarters to explain if caught. Inside the hollow, she kept her tools, a flat stone for grinding, a small clay bowl she'd stolen from the kitchen, strips of clean cotton for filtering. The book had said to crack the pits, grind the kernels into paste, and add water. The amygdalin would convert to prussic acid naturally. The smell would be of bitter almonds, distinctive, damning. Her first attempt had failed. She'd ground the kernels too coarsely, added too much water. The mixture had produced nothing but a bitter, useless sludge that she'd buried at the base of the oak tree like a grave. Her second attempt had been better. She ground 40 pits into fine powder, added just enough water to make a thick paste, then left it sealed in the clay bowl for 3 days. When she'd returned and opened it, the smell had hit her immediately, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Bitter almonds. The scent of cyanide. The scent of liberation. She'd nearly wept. It was Temperance who'd found her. Delphine had been crouched by the oak tree, filtering the liquid through cotton into a tiny glass vial she'd taken from the house, a medicine bottle, once filled with laudanum, now repurposed for murder. The moon was high, giving just enough light to work by. She'd been so focused she hadn't heard footsteps in the grass. Delphine. She'd spun around, heart exploding in her chest, the vial clutched in her hand. Temperance stood 3 feet away, her dark face silvered by moonlight. She was younger than Delphine by 5 years, a kitchen worker with burned scars on her forearms and a 6-year-old daughter named Ruth who already worked in the main house. Temperance had kind eyes, but there was steel in her too. You didn't survive Whitmore's plantation without steel. What are you doing out here? Temperance's voice was barely a whisper. Delphine had frozen. Her mind raced through excuses, explanations, anything to hide what she was doing. But something in Temperance's face stopped her. Not suspicion. Recognition. What does it look like? Delphine heard herself say. Temperance had stepped closer, looking down at the bowl, the ground kernels, the filtered liquid in the vial. Her eyes had widened slightly. Then she'd looked up at Delphine, and for a long moment, they'd simply stared at each other. For him? Temperance had asked quietly. Delphine had nodded once. Another silence. A night bird called from somewhere in the dark. The peach trees rustled. Then Temperance knelt beside her in the grass. Show me how. They'd worked together after that, careful and methodical. Temperance could move through the house more easily, accessing areas Delphine couldn't reach. She'd stolen the lavender water from Lorelei's vanity, bottle after bottle, replaced so gradually no one noticed. She'd distracted Silas when Delphine needed extra time in the orchard. She'd kept watch when Delphine soaked the collar's inner lining with the poison, tiny amounts applied over weeks so the fabric absorbed it completely. "Why are you helping me?" Delphine had asked one night as they worked beneath the oak tree, grinding more pits, refining their technique. Temperance had been quiet for a long time. Then, "Ruth asked me yesterday why white children get to play while she scrubs floors. She's 6 years old, Delphine. 6. And I couldn't answer her. I couldn't tell her the truth, that she'll scrub floors until her hands crack and bleed, that she'll be used however they want to use her, that she owns nothing, not even her own body." She'd looked up, her eyes fierce. "I can't kill all of them. But I can help you kill this one." Delphine had reached across the space between them and gripped Temperance's hand. No words. Just that grip, that understanding. They were not friends, exactly. Friendship was a luxury. But they were something deeper, co-conspirators in the oldest war, two women who'd looked into the face of their own powerlessness and decided to steal back whatever they could, even if it was only this, the power to end one life that had destroyed so many. The plantation house looked beautiful from the outside. White columns, wraparound porches, gardens manicured to perfection. But Delphine saw the rot beneath. The floorboards that sagged in the western parlor. The mold creeping behind the silk wallpaper in the guest rooms. The way the foundation had begun to settle, creating cracks in the plaster that Whitmore painted over every spring rather than repair properly. The South itself was rotting, though the masters couldn't see it yet. They threw their grand parties, married their daughters, bought more slaves, and convinced themselves this world would last forever. But Delphine could feel it, a trembling in the earth, a sickness in the air. Something was coming. Not soon enough to save her, not soon enough to save Cassius, but coming nonetheless. Until then, she would do what she could. She'd finished the collar 3 days ago. The final application of poison had been almost ritualistic. She'd waited until midnight, until the house was silent except for the creaking of old wood and the distant singing from the quarters, someone's voice raised in a spiritual, the notes floating through the humid dark. She'd spread the collar on her workbench, the linen ghostly white in the candlelight. The vial of poison had been nearly empty, she'd used almost everything, soaking it into the fabric in layers, letting each application dry before adding the next. The inner surface of the collar, the part that would press against Whitmore's skin for hours, was saturated with cyanide. She'd touched it carefully, using a cloth to protect her own skin. The bitter almond scent had risen faintly, and she'd masked it immediately with lavender water, soaking the outer fabric until the floral smell dominated. Then she'd stitched the final seam, her needle moving through the fabric with absolute precision. Each stitch perfect. Each stitch a prayer. For Cassius. For Mama. For every one of us who's been broken and sold and used and discarded. When she'd finished, she'd held the collar up to the candlelight. Beautiful. Deadly. A masterpiece. She'd wrapped it in muslin and locked it away. Now, 2 months of planning had culminated in that fitting, in Whitmore's thick neck encircled by her work, in his pulse jumping beneath the poisoned fabric, in his casual cruelty about her gifted hands. Delphine sat in the sewing room now, the evening light fading to purple through the window. Her fingers moved automatically over Lorelei's veil, adding delicate flowers to the lace border. White roses. Symbol of purity. Symbol of death. 3 days. In 3 days, Thaddeus Whitmore would dress for his wedding. He would fasten that collar around his throat with his own hands. He would wear it for hours, through the ceremony, through the reception, through his triumph. And the poison would work its way into his skin, his blood, his arrogant, beating heart. Delphine's needle caught the last light. Outside, the peach trees whispered in the wind. Justice, Delphine had learned, sometimes grew on trees. You just had to know which fruit to pick. 1 week before the wedding, the plantation transformed into a fever dream of white lace and lies. Delphine stood in the main parlor at dawn, watching house slaves drape garlands of white camellias across the mantelpiece while Lorelei Ashford directed them with the imperious gesture of a conductor leading an orchestra. The bride-to-be had arrived from Charleston 3 days prior with trunks full of silk gowns, pearl jewelry, and the kind of breathless excitement that could only belong to someone who'd never known suffering. No, no, the flowers must cascade, not droop, Lorelei said, her voice pitched high with displeasure. She was 23, porcelain-skinned, with dark hair arranged in elaborate ringlets that her lady's maid spent 2 hours creating each morning. Beautiful in the way of hothouse flowers, delicate, ornamental, requiring constant maintenance. Ruth, fetch more wire. These stems are too weak. Ruth, Temperance's daughter, scurried away, her small bare feet silent on the Persian rug. She was 6 years old and already learned the art of invisibility. Delphine watched the child disappear into the hallway, her thin shoulders hunched as if anticipating a blow. Delphine. Lorelei turned to her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I trust my veil is progressing satisfactorily. Yes, Miss Lorelei. Nearly complete. Show me. Delphine retrieved the veil from her sewing basket, yards of imported Brussels lace, so fine it seemed woven from spider silk and moonlight. She'd spent 40 hours on the embroidery alone, orange blossoms for fertility, roses for love, intricate scrollwork that spelled out amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. The irony tasted like copper on her tongue. Lorelei took the veil with hands that had never scrubbed a floor, never picked cotton, never been struck for moving too slowly. She held it up to the morning light streaming through the tall windows, examining each stitch with the critical eye of someone accustomed to perfection. It's exquisite, she said finally, and something in her voice softened. You truly are talented, Delphine. Thaddeus is fortunate to have you. Have me. As if Delphine were a possession, a tool, a thing to be owned rather than a woman with a beating heart and a murdered soul. Thank you, Miss Lorelei. Lorelei draped the veil over a chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where workers were erecting a white arbor for the ceremony. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like funeral shrouds, and magnolia blossoms, past their prime now in the June heat, released a cloying sweetness that smelled less like flowers and more like decay. I shall be so happy here, Lorelei said dreamily. Thaddeus has promised me everything, a trip to Paris next spring, a box at the Charleston Theatre, a new carriage with matched grays. And this house, she turned back to the parlor, her eyes sweeping over the mahogany furniture, the crystal chandelier, the silk wallpaper imported from France. It's like something from a novel. So grand. So romantic. Delphine felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Romantic. This house where children were sold away from their mothers. Where backs were whipped until they bled. Where women were used in the dark and then discarded. Where old Isaiah, the stable hand, bore a brand on his cheek in the shape of Whitmore's initial, punishment for trying to run 20 years ago. Romantic. I'm certain you'll be very happy, Miss Lorelei, Delphine said, because that was what she was supposed to say. Lorelei smiled, oblivious to the rage burning behind Delphine's carefully neutral expression. You know, Delphine, I've always believed that a contented household begins with contented servants. I intend to be a kind mistress. Perhaps I'll allow you extra fabric for your own dresses. Would you like that? The condescension was breathtaking. Extra fabric. As if Delphine should be grateful for scraps from the master's table. As if kindness could exist within the framework of ownership. That's very generous, Miss Lorelei. I think we shall get along wonderfully. Lorelei retrieved her veil, handling it with reverent care. I'll need this by tomorrow evening for the final fitting with my gown. Don't disappoint me. No, Miss Lorelei. The bride swept from the room in a rustle of taffeta, leaving behind the scent of rosewater and privilege. Ruth crept back in with the wire, her eyes wide and frightened. Delphine wanted to comfort her, to promise that things would get better, but she'd learned long ago that promising impossible things to children was its own form of cruelty. "You did well," Delphine said quietly instead. "Go find your mama in the kitchen. Tell her I said you've earned a biscuit." Ruth's face lit up. Such a small thing, a biscuit, but in this world, small mercies were everything. The child disappeared again, and Delphine was left alone in the parlor surrounded by white flowers that would wilt within days. That afternoon, Silas Crenshaw whipped Marcus in the yard behind the stables. Delphine heard it from the sewing room, the crack of leather on flesh, Marcus's screams, Crenshaw's voice counting out the lashes with mechanical precision. 20. 25. 30. The sound carried through the humid air, mixing with the buzz of cicadas and the distant singing from the tobacco fields. She kept sewing. There was nothing else she could do. To intervene was to invite the lash herself, or worse. So she kept her needle moving through the lace, kept her eyes on her work, kept her rage buried beneath years of practice at swallowing horror. Marcus's crime, looking at Crenshaw wrong. That was all. A glance that lasted a moment too long, interpreted as insolence by a man who lived to find reasons to inflict pain. When the screaming finally stopped, Delphine set down her needle and allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the workbench until they steadied. The plantation house was beautiful from the outside, everyone said so. Visitors from Charleston praised its architecture, its gardens, its gracious southern charm. But Delphine knew what it really was, a tomb decorated with silk and silver, a monument to cruelty wrapped in elegance. The rot was everywhere if you knew where to look. In the floorboards beneath the Persian rugs, warped from water damage that Whitmore refused to repair properly. In the mold creeping behind the wallpaper in the guest wing, making dark maps of decay. In the foundation settling unevenly, creating cracks in the plaster that were painted over each spring but never truly fixed. The entire South was like this house, beautiful on the surface, rotting from within. The masters didn't see it, or refused to. They threw their parties and married their children and convinced themselves this world would last forever. But Delphine could feel it trembling beneath her feet. Something was coming. Not soon enough for Marcus, not soon enough for Ruth, not soon enough for any of them. But coming. Until then, she had the collar. That night, she worked by candlelight while the house slept. The veil lay spread across her workbench, nearly complete. She was embroidering the final border, delicate flowers intertwined with scrolling vines. Her needle moved in and out of the lace with hypnotic precision, each stitch so small it was almost invisible. This was her gift and her curse, the ability to create beauty for people who would never see her as human. She thought of Lorelei's words that morning. Amor vincit omnia. Love conquers all. But Delphine had learned a different truth, love conquered nothing. Love couldn't stop a child from being sold. Love couldn't prevent a whipping. Love couldn't make masters see slaves as people rather than property. Only death could do that. Her needle paused, hovering above the lace. In 3 days, Lorelei would wear this veil. She would walk down the aisle toward Thaddeus Whitmore, who would be dressed in his finest, including the collar that Delphine had spent 2 months poisoning with patient, meticulous care. The collar waited in the locked drawer of her workbench, wrapped in muslin like a christening gown. She'd applied the final dose of cyanide 3 days ago, and the bitter almond scent had faded beneath layers of lavender water. The poison was invisible now, soaked deep into the linen fibers, waiting for the prolonged contact with skin, for sweat and heat to activate it. She'd researched it obsessively using the botanical book, calculating dosages, timing, symptoms. Cyanide worked quickly once absorbed. Within hours, the victim would experience burning sensations, difficulty breathing, rapid heartbeat. Then convulsions. Then death. But it required sustained contact. A brief touch wouldn't be enough. Whitmore would need to wear the collar for several hours, the fabric pressed against the thin skin of his throat, the poison working its way into his bloodstream with patient malevolence. The wedding would last hours. The ceremony, the reception, the dancing, the toasts. He would be dressed in his finest the entire time, proud and preening, surrounded by Charleston society while death soaked through his skin. Delphine resumed her stitching. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, a mockingbird sang its stolen songs, and somewhere in the quarters, someone was crying, soft, muffled sobs that spoke of grief too deep for loud expression. She understood that grief. She carried it like a second skeleton beneath her skin. But in 3 days, she would transform it into something else. Not peace, she would never have peace. Not justice, there was no justice for people like her. But retribution. Cold, perfect, irreversible retribution. The needle moved in and out of the lace, creating beauty, creating irony, creating the veil that would frame a bride's face as she married a dead man walking. Love conquers all, the embroidery proclaimed. But poison, Delphine had learned, was more reliable than love. If you're captivated by this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre stories from history's shadows, and comment below with your thoughts. The day before the wedding arrived with a dawn the color of blood oranges, the sky streaked with crimson that turned the plantation's white columns pink as flesh. Delphine woke in the quarters to the sound of roosters and the low murmur of prayer, old Isaiah's voice carrying through the thin walls, asking God for strength to survive another day. She didn't pray anymore. Not since Cassius. The house was already chaos when she entered through the kitchen door. Temperance stood at the stove, sweat streaming down her face as she stirred pots of grits and gravy for the guests who'd begun arriving yesterday, cousins from Savannah, business associates from Charleston, Lorelei's parents with their retinue of personal servants. The kitchen smelled of frying bacon and fresh biscuits, and beneath it all, the ever-present scent of wood smoke and fear. "Morning," Temperance said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Morning." Delphine moved past her, their hands brushing for just a moment, a touch that conveyed everything they couldn't say aloud. "Today. It happens today. Tomorrow he's dead." Ruth sat in the corner shelling peas, her small fingers working mechanically. She looked up when Delphine entered, and something in the child's eyes, some ancient weariness that no 6-year-old should possess, made Delphine's heart clench. "Miss Delphine." Ruth's voice was barely audible over the kitchen noise. "Is it true they're having ice cream at the wedding? Molly said white people can make winter come in summer." "It's true," Delphine said softly. "Ice brought down from the north, packed in sawdust." "I wish I could taste winter," Ruth said, then quickly returned to her peas as the housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, a white woman as cruel as she was efficient, swept into the kitchen barking orders. Delphine climbed the back stairs to the main house, her arms laden with the completed veil wrapped in protective muslin. The hallways were crowded with guests and servants, everyone preparing for tomorrow's spectacle. She caught glimpses through open doorways, ladies having their hair dressed, gentlemen smoking cigars and discussing cotton prices, children running in expensive clothes that cost more than a slave's life. At the end of the upstairs hallway, Whitmore's chamber door stood ajar. Her heart began to pound. She knocked softly, and his voice called out, "Enter." He was standing before a full-length mirror in his shirt sleeves and trousers, examining his reflection with the self-satisfaction of a man who'd never doubted his own magnificence. The room smelled of bay rum and tobacco. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like tiny worlds spinning. "Ah, Delphine." He turned to her with a smile. "Perfect timing. I was just thinking I should try on the complete ensemble. Tomorrow there'll be no time for adjustments." "Yes, Master Whitmore." Her voice was steady, though her pulse hammered in her throat. She set down the wrapped veil on a side table and moved to the wardrobe where his wedding attire hung, black frock coat, pearl gray waistcoat, silk cravat, and, there, wrapped in tissue paper on the highest shelf, the collar. Her collar. Her murder weapon, disguised as fine haberdashery. She retrieved it carefully, her fingers steady despite the roaring in her ears. The muslin fell away, revealing the perfect white linen beneath. The stitching was invisible. The poison was invisible. Everything invisible except her racing heart. "Let me help you, master." She approached him, the collar held between both hands like an offering to some terrible god. He tilted his head back, exposing the vulnerable column of his throat. She could see his pulse jumping beneath the skin, strong and steady. The intimacy of this moment was obscene, her hands at his neck, the man who'd destroyed her life trusting her completely, never imagining that destruction could flow both ways. The collar settled around his throat. She fastened the brass stud at the back, her fingers working with practiced efficiency. The fabric pressed against his skin, that skin that had never known the lash, never known chains, never known anything but comfort and privilege purchased with blood. "It's still rather stiff," he complained, shifting his shoulders. "Are you certain this will soften?" "Yes, master. Linen always relaxes with body heat and moisture. And the moisture of your sweat will drive the poison deeper. And your body heat will activate it. And you'll wear this for hours tomorrow, proud as a peacock, while cyanide seeps into your blood." He turned to the mirror, admiring himself. His fingers came up to touch the collar's edge, and for one heart-stopping moment, Delphine thought he would detect something, some chemical trace, some evidence of tampering. But he only smoothed the fabric, adjusting the way it sat against his jaw. "Excellent work," he pronounced. "Truly excellent." She helped him into the waistcoat, the frock coat, fastening buttons and adjusting lapels with the meticulous attention that had become her armor. He preened before the mirror, turning this way and that, and she stood behind him, their reflections captured together in the glass. Master and slave. Owner and owned. Except she was about to own his death. "You know, Delphine," he said, still admiring himself, "Lorelei was quite impressed with your work on her veil. She thinks you're the finest seamstress in the Lowcountry. High praise from a Charleston girl." "I'm honored, master." "You should be." He unbuttoned the coat, shrugged it off. "I've been thinking, after the wedding, once we're settled, I might hire you out to some of the neighboring plantations. Your skills could bring in good money. What do you think?" What did she think? She thought of being sent away from the only place she knew, from Temperance and the fragile community in the quarters. She thought of being rented out like equipment, her body and skills sold by the hour to strangers. She thought of the casual cruelty in his voice, discussing her future as if she had no say in it, because she didn't. "Whatever pleases you, Master Whitmore." He nodded, as if her compliance was as natural as breathing. He removed the waistcoat, then reached up to unfasten the collar. Delphine's breath caught as he worked the brass stud loose and pulled the linen away from his throat. There, just there, she could see the faintest redness on his skin where the collar had pressed. A slight irritation. The first kiss of poison. "Tomorrow, it will be so much worse." He handed her the collar. "Keep this safe. I'll want everything laid out in the dressing room by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. The ceremony begins at 10. "Yes, Master Whitmore." She wrapped the collar carefully in its muslin, her hands steady despite the chaos in her chest. He was still talking, saying something about the guest list, about Senator Hammond bringing his wife, about the photographer from Charleston who would document everything. She nodded at appropriate intervals, playing her part perfectly. Then he said something that turned her blood to ice water. "Oh, I nearly forgot to mention, I had a letter yesterday from that trader. Henderson, his name is. The one I sold your boy to." The room tilted. Delphine gripped the wrapped collar so tightly her knuckles went white. "Master?" "Yes, apparently he ended up selling the boy to a plantation in Alabama. Cotton operation, I believe." Whitmore was pulling on a casual jacket now, completely oblivious to the way Delphine had gone rigid. "Henderson said the boy's been working out well." Strong for his age. Should make a good field hand once he's grown. Alabama. Cassius was in Alabama. Working cotton fields under the brutal sun, his clever mind and gentle heart being crushed beneath the weight of endless labor. Henderson mentioned he might be passing through again next year, Whitmore continued, straightening his cuffs. If the boy's still alive and properly trained, might be worth buying him back at a profit. Good breeding stock eventually, I'd imagine. Breeding stock. Her son. Her beautiful, bright son who'd been learning his letters, who'd asked questions about everything, who'd called her mama in a voice full of trust and love. Breeding stock. Something inside Delphine, some final restraint she'd been maintaining, snapped like a dry twig. That's good to know, master. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. Yes, well. He moved toward the door. I'm due to meet Senator Hammond for cigars. You may go. And Delphine, he paused, looking back at her. Truly exceptional work. Your hands are wasted in the quarters. You have a gift. He left. Delphine stood alone in his chamber, surrounded by his things, his smell, his presence. The wrapped collar felt impossibly heavy in her hands. The redness on his throat where the fabric had touched him seemed to burn in her vision. Alabama. Field work. Breeding stock. Her son. She walked to the window and looked out at the gardens where workers were putting the final touches on the wedding arbor. White silk ribbons fluttered in the breeze. White roses climbed the posts. Everything white and pure and beautiful, built on suffering. Tomorrow, Thaddeus Whitmore would fasten this collar around his throat with his own hands. He would wear it for hours, through the ceremony where he'd promised to love and cherish Lorelei until death did them part. Through the reception where he'd toast to his future, his happiness, his prosperity. And death would be there, pressed against his skin, soaking through with every drop of sweat, every beat of his vile heart. Alabama. Her baby in Alabama, being worked like an animal. Delphine's hands had stopped shaking. Her breathing had steadied. The doubt she'd been harboring, the small, terrible voice that had whispered murder is wrong, murder makes you like them, was silent now. This wasn't murder. This was pest control. She left his chamber and descended the back stairs, the collar wrapped and ready. The kitchen was still chaotic. Temperance had moved on to preparing vegetables, Ruth was still shelling peas, Mrs. Pritchard was screaming at a housemaid who'd chipped a plate. Delphine caught Temperance's eye as she passed through. No words. Just a look. Tomorrow. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her pallet in the quarters, listening to the sounds of other people's breathing, other people's dreams. Through the thin walls, she could hear old Isaiah's ragged snoring, someone's baby crying, the low murmur of a couple making love with desperate quietness. She thought of Cassius in Alabama. Was he sleeping now? Was he hungry? Was he hurt? Did he remember her face, or had 3 years erased her from his memory? She thought of Whitmore, sleeping peacefully in his fine bed, dreaming of his wedding day, his beautiful bride, his bright future. She thought of the collar, locked in her workbench drawer, waiting. Tomorrow, she would watch him dress. She would watch him fasten that collar around his throat. She would watch him marry Lorelei beneath the white arbor with its white roses and white ribbons. And then she would watch him die. The night stretched on, endless as grief, patient as poison. Dawn would come. The wedding would happen. And Delphine, scarred, broken, unbreakable Delphine, would finally reclaim the only power left to her, the power to make a master bleed. The wedding day dawned clear and merciless, the June sun already brutal by 7 in the morning. Delphine had been awake since before first light, helping to dress Lorelei in the main house while her own heart beat a countdown in her chest. Hours. Just hours now. Lorelei's chamber was a chaos of silk and perfume. The bride stood in her corset and petticoats while her ladies maid laced her into the wedding gown, white satin with a train that would sweep the garden grass, pearl buttons running down the spine like vertebrae. Delphine waited with the veil, watching the performance of white womanhood preparing for its triumph. "Oh, I'm so nervous," Lorelei breathed, pressing a hand to her corseted waist. "What if I stumble? What if my voice shakes during the vows? What if your husband drops dead at the altar?" Delphine thought, but said only, "You'll be perfect, Miss Lorelei." At 8 o'clock, she was summoned to Whitmore's dressing room. He was already partially dressed, trousers, white shirt, the pearl gray waistcoat. He smelled of bay rum and nervous sweat, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the carefully laid out attire. "The collar, Delphine. Quickly now. Guests are already arriving." This was it. The moment 2 months of planning had built toward. She retrieved the collar from its muslin wrapping, her movements smooth and practiced despite the roaring in her ears. The linen was cool between her fingers, innocent-looking, perfect. The poison was invisible, odorless now beneath the lavender water, waiting. "Come here, master." Her voice was steady. He stood before her, tilting his chin up, exposing his throat. She could see the faint redness still there from yesterday's fitting, the first kiss of cyanide. Today would be so much more than a kiss. The collar settled around his neck. She fastened the brass stud, her fingers not quite touching his skin but close enough to feel his body heat. The fabric pressed against his throat, that vulnerable column of flesh where his pulse jumped, strong and steady. "Not for long." "Still stiff," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Damn thing feels like a noose." Delphine's lips almost curved into a smile. "It will relax as you wear it, master. Give it time." "Time." "Yes. Time and sweat and body heat to drive the poison deep into his bloodstream. Time for the cyanide to accumulate until his cells couldn't process oxygen anymore, until his blood turned to poison, until his heart, that vile, beating heart, finally stopped." She helped him into the frock coat, fastening buttons with meticulous care. He looked magnificent, she had to admit. Tall and broad-shouldered, expensively dressed, the picture of Southern aristocracy. No one looking at him would see the cruelty, the casual violence, the ledger books where children were listed as assets and losses. "Excellent," he pronounced, examining himself in the mirror. "Absolutely excellent. You've outdone yourself, Delphine." "Thank you, Master Whitmore." He touched the collar, adjusting it slightly, and Delphine held her breath. But he only smoothed the fabric, preening, admiring his own reflection. Then he turned to her with an expression that might have been kindness on a different man's face. "After today, I'll be a married man. A husband. Eventually, God willing, a father." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been sentiment if he'd been capable of genuine feeling. "I want you to know, Delphine, that I value your service. You're a credit to this household." She wanted to spit in his face. She wanted to scream about Cassius, about Alabama, about breeding stock and broken families and 3 years of grief that felt like drowning. But she only lowered her eyes and murmured, "You're too kind, master." He left for the garden, and she was alone in his dressing room, trembling with the weight of what she'd done. The collar was on him now. There was no going back. By 10 o'clock, the garden had transformed into a vision from a fever dream. White chairs arranged in perfect rows. The arbor draped with silk and climbing roses. A string quartet from Charleston playing Schubert. Guests in their finest, the men in dark frock coats, the women in pastel silks with parasols to shield them from the brutal sun. Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze, and magnolias released their cloying sweetness that smelled more like death than beauty. The enslaved people of Whitmore plantation stood at the back, required witnesses to this spectacle. Delphine stood between Temperance and old Isaiah, all of them dressed in their Sunday clothes, the costume of servitude made presentable for white eyes. Ruth stood with her mother, holding Temperance's hand, her 6-year-old face solemn and uncomprehending. She'd been given a special task, scattering rose petals before the bride's entrance. The honor had terrified her. How long? Temperance whispered, so quietly only Delphine could hear. Hours. It needs sustained contact. Prolonged exposure. And you're certain? Delphine nodded once. She'd researched obsessively, calculated dosages, tested and refined. The poison would work. It had to work. The quartet shifted to a wedding march. Lorelei appeared at the garden entrance in her white gown and veil, Delphine's veil, that intricate lacework that had taken 40 hours to complete. Amor vincit omnia embroidered in delicate script. Love conquers all. But love had never conquered Thaddeus Whitmore. Only death would manage that. Ruth scattered her rose petals with trembling hands. Lorelei glided down the aisle on her father's arm, radiant with joy and ignorance. And at the arbor, Thaddeus Whitmore waited, handsome in his wedding finery, the collar pressed snug against his throat. Delphine watched. She didn't blink. Didn't look away. This was her work, her planning, her retribution taking physical form. The minister began to speak. Generic words about love and devotion and God's blessing on the union. Delphine heard none of it. She was watching Whitmore's neck, looking for signs, counting minutes, calculating the dosage working its way into his blood. 20 minutes into the ceremony, she saw it, Whitmore's hand coming up to his collar, scratching briefly at his neck. A small gesture, easily missed. But Delphine caught it, and her heart leaped. It was the beginning. To have and to hold, from this day forward. 30 minutes. Whitmore shifted his weight, uncomfortable in the heat. Or was it discomfort from something else? Delphine leaned forward slightly, straining to see. Yes, there. A flush spread across his face. He was sweating more heavily than the temperature warranted, droplets running down his temples. The poison was activating. His sweat was driving it deeper into his skin, his body heat breaking down the cyanide compounds, his own biology becoming the delivery system for his death. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. Temperance's hand found Delphine's, their fingers interlacing briefly. No words. Just that pressure, that acknowledgement. We're watching him die. We're watching, and we're not sorry. In sickness and in health. 45 minutes. The vows concluded. Whitmore kissed his bride, and even from this distance, Delphine could see that his color was wrong, too flushed, almost purple. He was scratching at his collar again, more insistently now. Loosening it slightly. But not removing it. Thank God or the devil or whatever force governed the universe, he wasn't removing it. The guests erupted in applause. The quartet launched into something celebratory. Whitmore and Lorelei walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, and Delphine watched the new groom stumble slightly, catch himself, and continue walking with forced steadiness. Did you see that? Temperance breathed. I saw. The reception was held on the great lawn, beneath a canopy to shield guests from the murderous sun. Long tables draped in white linen. Crystal champagne flutes. Servants moving among the guests with trays of delicacies, oysters on ice, cold chicken, strawberries and cream. The enslaved people remained at the periphery, serving when called, invisible otherwise. Delphine carried a tray of champagne, moving through the crowd with downcast eyes and careful steps, every nerve in her body focused on Whitmore. He was at the head table with Lorelei, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. But something was wrong. Even his guests were beginning to notice. He was sweating profusely, his face an alarming shade of red. He kept pulling at his collar, and his breathing seemed labored. Thaddeus, darling, are you quite well? Lorelei's voice carried across the lawn, pitched high with concern. You look feverish. Just the heat, he said, but his voice was hoarse. This damned collar, too tight. Perhaps you should loosen it, Senator Hammond suggested from across the table. No, no. Whitmore waved the suggestion away, though his hand trembled. Just need some air. And water. Someone fetch me water. Delphine moved forward with her tray, her heart hammering. Water, master. He looked up at her, and for a moment, just a moment, their eyes met. Did he know? Could he sense what she'd done? But there was only confusion in his gaze, and discomfort, and the first edge of real fear. Yes. Water. Quickly. She set down the champagne and went to fetch water, her legs steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Behind her, she heard Lorelei's voice rising in pitch, "Thaddeus, your neck, it's so red. What's wrong with your neck?" By the time Delphine returned with the water, Whitmore was pulling at his collar in earnest, his fingers clumsy, his breathing coming in short gasps. The collar came loose, revealing angry red welts where the fabric had pressed against his skin. Chemical burns. The visible evidence of poison working. "I can't," he gasped. "Can't breathe properly. Someone fetch a doctor." Lorelei shrieked. But Delphine knew no doctor could help. The cyanide was in his bloodstream now, binding to his cells, preventing them from using oxygen. His own body was suffocating from within. The guests were on their feet now, crowding around the head table. Whitmore stood, swaying, one hand clutching his throat. His face had gone from red to an ashen gray. His eyes were wide, panicked, as his body finally understood what his mind couldn't comprehend: he was dying. "The collar," someone said. "Something's wrong with the collar." Whitmore's knees buckled. He crashed into the table, sending crystal and china flying. Lorelei screamed. Men rushed forward to catch him, but he was convulsing now, his body jerking, foam specking his lips. Delphine stood perfectly still, the water glass still in her hand, watching. This was for Cassius. For her mother. For every person Whitmore had brutalized and broken and sold. For Marcus, still bleeding from yesterday's whipping. For Ruth, who would scrub floors until her hands cracked. For all of them who lived and died as property. Whitmore's eyes rolled back. His convulsions intensified, then suddenly stopped. He lay still on the grass, his wedding finery rumpled, his face frozen in an expression of shock and agony. The garden was chaos, women screaming, men shouting. Lorelei collapsed beside her husband's body, wailing like something ancient and primal. And through it all, Delphine stood at the periphery, invisible as always, the water glass cool in her hand, watching the man who destroyed her life finally pay for his sins. Temperance appeared beside her, Ruth clutching her skirts. "Is he?" Temperance whispered. "Yes," Delphine said quietly. "He's dead." Death arrived at Whitmore plantation dressed in white silk and summer heat, and it lingered long after the body was carried inside. The doctor from Charleston came within the hour, summoned by a rider on Whitmore's fastest horse. He examined the corpse laid out in the parlor, that same parlor where Lorelei had gushed about romance just days before, and pronounced the cause of death uncertain. Heart failure, perhaps. The intense heat. But his eyes kept returning to the angry red welts on Whitmore's neck, the chemical burns that circled his throat like accusatory fingers. "The collar," he said finally, holding up the incriminating garment. "There's something wrong with this collar." The overseer, Silas Crenshaw, snatched it from the doctor's hands and lifted it to his nose. His face darkened. "Almonds," he said. "Smells like bitter almonds." And just like that, the investigation began. Delphine was in the kitchen when they came for her. She'd been washing dishes with mechanical precision, her hands moving through hot water while her mind replayed Whitmore's convulsions, his final gasps, the blessed relief of watching him die. Crenshaw burst through the door with two of Lorelei's male relatives. His face was purple with rage, and in his hand he held the collar, wrapped now in cloth like evidence of witchcraft. "You," he snarled, pointing at Delphine. "You made this." It wasn't a question. The kitchen fell silent. Temperance stood frozen at the stove. Ruth began to cry softly. Yes, Delphine said quietly. I made the collar. And you poisoned it. She met his eyes. 34 years she'd spent looking down, but now, with Whitmore dead and her work complete, she could look a white man in the face without flinching. I don't know what you mean. Crenshaw's hand shot out and struck her across the face, the blow hard enough to split her lip. Blood filled her mouth. She didn't cry out. Lying bitch, he spat. You murdered your master. I sewed a collar, Delphine said, her voice steady despite the blood. If Master Whitmore is dead, that's God's will, not mine. They dragged her to the shed behind the stables, the same shed where the whipping post stood, where blood had soaked into the dirt floor for decades. They tied her wrists to a beam above her head and left her there while they tore apart the quarters, searching for evidence. She hung there as the sun climbed higher, her arms screaming with pain. But physical discomfort was nothing compared to what she'd endured for 34 years. What she felt instead was a cold, crystalline clarity. Whitmore was dead. Whatever happened now, that fact remained. Her son's tormentor was dead, and she had killed him. They came back as evening fell. Crenshaw entered with old Isaiah, who was limping, his face bruised. Tell her what you told me, Crenshaw commanded. Isaiah wouldn't meet Delphine's eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. They said they'd kill me. Tell her. I saw you. In the orchard. Several times at odd hours. His voice broke. I'm sorry, Delphine. Delphine understood. Isaiah was 70 years old with a lifetime of survival carved into his bones. He'd done what he had to do. It's all right, she said softly. I forgive you. Crenshaw moved closer. Peach pits contain prussic acid. You're going to hang, Delphine. But first, you're going to tell me who helped you. I worked alone. Liar. He struck her again. Was it Temperance? I worked alone. He hit her 3 more times. Her vision swam. But she kept her mouth shut, kept Temperance's name locked behind her teeth. Finally, Crenshaw stepped back. Fine. At dawn, we'll have a trial. By noon tomorrow, you'll be hanging from that oak tree by the road. He left, locking the shed behind him. The door opened again minutes later. Temperance slipped inside like a ghost. I can't stay long, she whispered. But I had to see you. I didn't tell them about you, Delphine said. I won't. I know. Temperance pressed something into Delphine's bound hand, a small glass vial. The last of the poison. I found it during the search. Hid it before Crenshaw could see. If they torture you, if it gets too bad. Delphine's fingers closed around the vial. The power to choose her own ending. Thank you, she breathed. Temperance kissed her forehead and then was gone. Delphine was alone in the darkness, the vial pressed against her palm like a promise. The trial occurred at dawn in the front yard. They untied Delphine from the beam but kept her wrists bound. She knelt in the dirt while Crenshaw and Lorelei's father presided over her judgment. There was no real question of guilt. The evidence was circumstantial but damning in a world where enslaved people were always guilty. Old Isaiah's testimony about the orchard. The collar's bitter almond scent. Delphine's own silence. The enslaved people of the plantation were forced to watch, lined up as witnesses to the consequences of resistance. Temperance stood with Ruth clutched to her chest. Marcus was there, his back still bandaged. All of them watching, all of them afraid. Lorelei sat on the porch in black mourning clothes, her face swollen from crying. She looked at Delphine with incomprehension. How could a slave commit murder? Delphine, Ashford said. You stand accused of willful murder through the use of poison. Do you have anything to say? She could have stayed silent. But some final flare of defiance made her speak. I made a collar with skills I was forced to develop, for a man who owned me like furniture. If that collar killed him, then perhaps he shouldn't have sold my son. Perhaps he shouldn't have built his fortune on people he never saw as human. Gasps from the watching slaves. Ashford's face went purple. You admit to murder, then? I admit to being a mother whose child was stolen. A woman whose body was never her own. She looked at Lorelei. You wanted to be the mistress of this house. Congratulations. You're the mistress of a tomb. I hope you're very happy here. Crenshaw struck her, but she barely felt it. She was beyond pain now. Hang her, Ashford pronounced. Immediately. Make it public. They dragged her toward the old oak tree by the road, where Spanish moss hung like widow's veils. A rope was already prepared, a noose tied with professional efficiency. Delphine's heart raced as they stood her on a wagon beneath the tree. Crenshaw fitted the noose around her neck. She could see the slaves watching from a distance, could see Temperance's tear-streaked face, could see Ruth being held back. This was her legacy, a woman who transformed grief into action, who'd killed a master and died unrepentant. Crenshaw read out her crimes: murder, poisoning, disobedience. Let this be a lesson to all who would raise their hand against their rightful masters. Delphine barely heard him. She was thinking of Cassius. Hoping he was alive. Hoping he'd hear someday about his mother who'd fought back. I am Delphine. I am my son's mother. I am not your property anymore. I never was. Her bound hands found the vial. In the chaos, they hadn't searched her thoroughly. One choice left: let them hang her, or take the poison and deny them even that satisfaction. She thought of the collar pressed against Whitmore's throat. She'd made that happen. She, enslaved, powerless, invisible Delphine, had killed a master. The vial felt like freedom in her hand. Crenshaw raised his hand to signal the driver. Delphine brought the vial to her lips, bit down, and swallowed. The bitter almond taste filled her mouth, familiar now, almost welcome. The same poison that had killed Whitmore. The same chemical liberation. Wait, what's she? Too late. The cyanide hit her bloodstream fast. Her vision blurred. Her heart stuttered. She felt herself falling, the rope catching her weight, but she was already dying, already beyond their reach. The last thing she saw was Spanish moss swaying in the breeze. The last thing she heard was Ruth's voice crying, Miss Delphine. The last thing she thought was, I chose this. I chose it. They buried her in the slave cemetery, an unmarked grave among hundreds. No stone. No name. Just red Carolina clay. But Temperance remembered. Old Isaiah remembered. Marcus and Ruth and all the others, they remembered the seamstress who'd laced cyanide into a master's collar, who transformed needlework into murder, who died with poison on her lips and defiance in her heart. The story spread, whispered in the quarters, carried from plantation to plantation. The seamstress who killed her master. The woman who chose death over submission. Lorelei left Whitmore plantation within a month. The plantation fell into disrepair, already rotting, it succumbed quickly. Within 2 years, creditors seized it. Within 5, it was abandoned. The war came, as Delphine had sensed it would. The world burned and changed. And in Alabama, a boy named Cassius grew into a man who never forgot his mother's face, who dreamed of her hands sewing by candlelight. He survived the war. He lived to see freedom. And when he was old enough, he told his children about the woman who'd borne him, loved him, and fought for him in ways he could only imagine. The story changed with each telling, but the core remained, a woman who'd been enslaved but never broken. A mother who'd turned grief into purpose. A seamstress who'd stitched death into fine linen and watched a master die. The collar was burned, but the memory lingered, passed down through generations, a story of resistance told in whispers and then, finally, in daylight. Justice, Delphine had learned, wasn't granted by courts or laws or master's mercy. Justice was something you took with your own scarred hands, even if it cost you everything. The peach trees in the orchard continued to bloom each spring, their fruit sweet and their pits bitter, and those who remained whispered prayers over Delphine's unmarked grave. She had been property. She had been invisible. She had been powerless. But in the end, she was magnificent. If you're captivated by this dark tale, subscribe for more macabre stories from history's shadows, and comment below with your thoughts.